All right, welcome to 5th grade unit number 4. We're going to explore the outer reaches of our universe. So 5th grade unit 4 is all about space and space systems and looking a lot at patterns that we can identify throughout our celestial bodies. Also, we're going to look at stars and how stars, the different views of stars, shapes of stars, things like that. So this unit begins with this idea of kind of what's in our solar system probe, and kids are kind of getting at their thoughts about what do we know about the universe, and then we kind of launch into a couple of video explanations, and they have a big question board because there's so many things you could study in the solar system. So trying to get a narrow focus, but also throughout the unit you can go off on small tangents if you need to with kids and really explore unique aspects of the solar system because this is one of the only times other than 1st grade that we studied the solar system, and so just this jumping into this idea of answering some of their questions before you move on. So this unit begins after that with a new unit to us from Picture Perfect STEM called Star Stuff. We read this book about Carl Sagan and the mysteries of the universe, and so he had that program on PBS for a long time, which kind of was a big component of understanding the cosmos and just exploring that. And so we learn about stars through that. We also look at some flashlight investigations where we look at the distance. We hold flashlights together at the same time to see if their brightness is equal, and then we move one far away, one close, and we look at how stars look different. And we talk about the apparent brightness of stars, and just because the star is brighter doesn't mean it's actually bigger. And we learn a little bit about our sun and how our sun is actually a pretty small star. And then we look at some scales. Our sun is actually, again, a small star. Our Earth is actually really small compared to the sun. But again, in the grander cosmos, our Earth and sun are pretty small. We read a book called Stars. As well, you have a copy of this at your text and learn a little bit more about stars. And then from there we go into constellations, and we look at seasonal patterns of constellations. And so students just learn a little bit about the constellations, and then we do a planetary exploration where they look at patterns and how constellations move throughout the night and how it's different seasons we see different constellations at different times. And it just kind of gives you a chance to hone in on some unique stars as students learn about constellations. We then move into sunrises and sunsets. So we read this book, Next Time You See a Sunset. Another one called Twilight Comes Twice. And we explore this idea of what is a sunrise really, and how we know about sunrises. We look at shadows. We collect data about shadows. You can either have students stand and draw their outline of their shadow and then mark it. Another way to do it is use a plunger, or this is not, but use a plunger and measure the distance at different times of the day and collect that data. So there's different ways to collect data, but the idea is for students to engage in this idea of what's really moving, how do we know that the Earth is moving, not the sun, and kind of this how we gain this idea of movement of our planet, and what's the daily pattern to that. We then do a discussion with our Earth. You have these blow-up globes, and we use a lamp with the shade removed and an approved bulb by Springdale schools. And we talk about how the movement of the Earth, we're going to have a light side, a dark side, day and night. We're going to have the process of that. And so this is another way to model and explain. So we do a lot of modeling. Students are going to be drawing this model. They're talking a lot about using modeling to explain their thinking. And again, I like to draw an arrow on my globe to know which way it spins. That way I don't screw it up. We also can talk about the tilt of our planet and talk about how we're moving around, we're spinning. There's just different ways you can talk about that with the globe. We then go into the changing moon, and we look at the moon and how the moon has a cycle. They've also talked a little bit about that in 1st grade, but again, there's a big disconnect between 1st and 5th. And so really talking about the moon cycle, they talk about when can we see the moon, can we see it in the day, how is the shape of the moon changing. So there's a couple different books that we're going to look at for that. Like Next Time You See the Moon, and another book called Rise the Moon. And they do a moon probe. There's a quiz at the end where they have to look at the phases of the moon to talk about how there are phases and why we have those phases. Similar to our globe investigation, students do a moon phase activity where they spin around and they look at the different phases of the moon as they go through. They see the light and dark side of the moon. There's always the dark side is always the same dark side of the moon. And so again, just this idea that the moon changes shape. The moon is not changing shape. The shadows are changing shape, and what causes that pattern. And then we end with some modeling again. So there's this. I designed a simple model that students can utilize. Where again, it feels kind of primary, but I think the goal of this is that students are using this to model, like, what's a day look like? Oh, that's spinning here. What's a year look like? What's a moon cycle? How does the moon move around? So just it's a way for students to model and explore just the phases of the Earth, phases of the moon, the cycles of the Earth and the moon. And so again, it may feel a little bit primary, but really the intention was to give students a model that they could create. It is not to scale. I think it's important to talk about kids that if this was a real size of the sun, the Earth would be like the size of a pin. The head of a pin. So it's a good conversation about scale. And then they end this unit with a ACT Aspired assessment, and that's about the amount of daylight that is cast onto two places on the Earth. So they look at daylight data, and they look at observations, and they look at patterns. What can you notice between the data? They look at the tilt of the Earth and some different models in the assessment. So again, it just kind of helps to wrap it all up. So again, this is such a vast unit, just like our universe is. And so I think your kids will enjoy exploring different facets of our solar system and really honing in on a few key components. So hopefully you guys enjoy being outside and making some observations of our solar system.